So, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm like, it's almost like talking to writers too. They have writer's block, right?
Oh yeah.
So how do you work through that struggle? And you know, I have a friend who is a writer, and her husband is a playwright. So
Mm,
and they both, you know, work at home as, and she said she never has had writer's block, but he does. So
yeah.
it's very interesting to compare how they work through their, you know,
Yeah.
and
No, there's actually a methodology for it. I mean, I went through a pretty intensive process called The Artist's Way, which is a book written by Julia Cameron. I think she used to be what's that famous movie director? Some Cameron, James Cameron. I think she used to be married to him. But she's a playwright and a writer in general, and she wrote this book a long time ago actually, and it's kind of a 12-week program that you put yourself through, but there's certain practices that you take with you through your life, and that was part of my approach to the whole writer's block problem. That, and really what it has to do with is acceptance. you know I think writers who have that capacity to accept what goes onto the page, regardless of whether they approve or they think it's worthy or not. That's really the primary ingredient to being able to, you know, keep writing, to write without that constant sense of anxiety. It's not that there won't be. I mean, even for people who don't suffer from writer's block, there's always some stress in there somewhere because you've got to do the unimaginable sometimes in balancing you know things that may be at odds with one another, or getting something to a destination and you're not quite sure how you're going to get there. I mean, it's like being lost in a city. You have to study the map a while to find your way out. But those who are accepting of being able to walk down the wrong alley, you know, and explore and say, oh, okay, so I went the wrong direction, so let's go somewhere else. I think that, in a nutshell, that's really kind of the cure for writer's block is acceptance. And it's kind of silly how simple it is and how long it can take some to get there. And, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm always there, but I've worked on it, many, many years. Therapy too, with somebody who specializes in creative processes. Um, and that's, it helps not only in terms of that, but just in
mhm.
general, quite
Yeah.
honestly. I mean, it's a great, way to evolve as a person.
Hmm. No, I agree. I think accepting is such a important thing in life, you know, in
Hmm.
human relationship as well, with children, with parents, with friends, right?
Exactly.
And it's not as easy as we think. I mean, I think like, okay, I'm kind of an understanding person. I'm sensitive. You know, but to really accept someone, or even go beyond that, like make the person feel like they're accepted, that's not an
Yeah.
easy thing to do. It's how we communicate, and that's how we think of the other person. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, you know, going through a low motivation period. That's also a way to accept ourselves, to say, okay,
Hmm.
you know, practicing our life is not just a straight line going up, right? Or steady
Right.
line. There is up and down. And it's not as easy as you think to accept myself. Like yesterday, I sat
Right.
on the couch, right? But I had to be reading a good book. Otherwise, I'll be like, okay, you're like wasting away on the couch. You're not doing anything, you know? So
Well,
I
you're
had a my book was my cover, you know. It's like, okay, I don't have to yell at myself because I have a good book. So
well. See, you're way ahead of me because I'm like usually, in the other room playing Call of Duty. A terrible, terrible, violent video game.
oh, is that Yeah, so it's not so easy accepting, you know. It's
Yeah,
hard. It's really, really hard. I think it's
yeah,
almost like you practice Buddhism or something. That's the highest
right.
level, you know. That's
Absolutely. No, I mean, even in my early 20s, I was interested in Buddhism just because of, for that very fact. I mean, I wanted, to learn, how, how do we overcome suffering or how do we accept suffering and, integrate it into, you know, uh, a, a life that, feels at peace or at least in balance. Of course, I didn't have the thoughts evolved to that point. I was just kind of just grabbing for straws at that point. But yeah, I mean, I think I mean, humans have been struggling with how to accept themselves since the beginning of humanity. I think
Mhm.
maybe that's one of the Achilles' heels of you know having a higher intelligence. Is well, now we have more ways of thinking about it. But the self acceptance, I think you were saying that it's way harder than anybody can imagine, and I think to a certain extent, yeah, accepting others, being more than equally difficult. It has to start from this personal, put the mask on first and then help who's ever sitting next to you, because I mean, if you can't accept certain failures or certain aspects of yourself that feel like failures, they're probably not actually failures, but that feel like failures, then you're always at a disadvantage in helping somebody else, you know yeah, because you're panting just trying to get a grip on your own life, much less accommodate somebody else's viewpoint that may or may not be in alignment with yours. Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of something that you wrote in your most recent post that
Hmm.
you sent us. You kind of ended it talking about you have to accept the turbulence and you're holding on to this core pulse or this core beat or something to kind of
Yeah.
grounded and tethered.
Yeah. I think as regards this piece, I mean, this piece has been very interesting process for me because it's kind of taken me into some territories that I haven't always been so comfortable with, and namely that is getting away from some sense of kind of metered rhythm. I'm I usually rely on these kind of metric structures, much in the same way that a writer might rely on meter in language, and then to go free verse all of a sudden where maybe there isn't a rhyme scheme or there isn't an actual you know recognizable pattern in a syllabic format, it would be very disconcerting. I think about this especially in relation to poetry, because like I try to imagine poets who just write almost like verse, and how hard that would be for somebody who is you know used to writing in forms that have more tethers, for for lack of a better term, and having to find the tethers in something that is freer like that, whereas that may be more natural for other people. So yeah, I mean, I think with this piece I have gone into that territory where it's like, yeah, this was the idea of freedom between the individual parts has not been something that I've explored very much at all. Where, you know, usually I know that I'm beat, two, that, clarinet, violin, piano are all aligning on this note. But there are some passages here where I'm like, okay, this could go for an indeterminate amount of time. Performers can, have some choice in that matter just to kind of feel when it's supposed to arrive here, Maybe that's 7 seconds down the line, maybe it's 10, but they'll, so to a certain extent, I've given over some control to the performers to articulate form, and not in the grander sense of the scheme, I'm not saying, well, this piece could either be 15 minutes or 7. you know, it's not to that degree, but to, in the way that the arrival happens, or what is felt as an arrival, depending on how much time they tend to take with this module or that module. There's going to be a little bit more burden or responsibility placed on on the performers to kind of interpret that with me as the composer, which I find kind of exciting, because it's like, okay, um, I don't find it easy to give up that level of control always, because I feel like I'm responsible, and I feel like I'm responsible for this thing to be the way it's supposed to be. But maybe I'm getting older, and now I'm like, you know what? I have to accept that I'm not always in control of things in the way that, maybe my personality or, my personal makeup would dictate that I should. And, I'm still, listening through it, internally 1,000 times with all the variations, to make sure that, well, yes, it could work as 10 seconds or it could work as 7. I'm still, doing that. But knowing full well the way, there's an infinite number of ways that it could be approached, and, I can't possibly cover all of that. So that has been, and it, at times it leads to, feelings of like, is this going to work? And then the motivation starts to lull, and then I'm like, yes, it's going to work. And, and then I hear it in a certain way, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, just because it hit my ear a certain way that day, it's like, I hear the next thing. But anyway, what else has been kind of exciting is that I know how it's, I know where I am now. I'm at 7 minutes. I'm, 10 is the goal. And I've arrived at what I had planned on arriving at, which is, the piano has been playing this kind of subsidiary role, this kind of triggering role up until this point, where, it's supplying kind of the atmosphere for the evolution of what's happening in the strings and the clarinet. But it keeps accumulating in terms of the amount that it's doing that within a certain period of time, and it arrives at this big piano solo. So like the arrival is kind of like a bait and switch. You've been hearing the piano just kind of being the instigator, but you realize now the whole thing has been leading to this moment for the pianist to really come into its own and articulate all of the ideas of the piece. And so now I'm stuck there. It's like, what do I write? No, I mean, I know the basics. It's working out the how it's the work out the delivery, really. That's going to be tricky.
So going back to a little bit of what you just touched, you said
sure.
You're giving a little bit more freedom in giving up less control. What led to that? Was it natural process, or it was some?
Yeah. I mean, and this is typically how I work too. I don't start out with a preconceived idea of what a piece is going to be. Some composers do. They set out a challenge for themselves, or they want to explore a certain thing. And I find that when I do that, oftentimes I don't get motivated to follow through on that, because the music, whatever comes out, whatever ideas come out, don't necessarily fall into whatever that, mold was that I had conceived. So I usually just listen to the music that comes out and say, okay, what is the most natural evolution for this? Or I start to hear that, I don't think what is, but I hear what that evolution is. And sometimes it comes to me along the way. So knowing that this kind of varying pulse framework was kind of at the core of this piece, and what I was really, captivated by at the very beginning. I knew that was somehow what I was going to explore, but I wasn't quite sure where it would go. And what I found is that, the more I varied it, the more it kind of wanted to separate. The more that these, I wanted the pulses always to be identifiable, but sometimes, the pulse in one instrument would be conflicting with the pulse in another instrument. That was, and a lot of times I will control that just by, changing the rhythms between the two parts and accenting in different places. And so I know exactly, okay, well, this is the relationship between the two parts. But in this case, because of the nature of the piece, it seemed more effective to allow the players to initiate that sense of how the pulse is, to be carried on until the next, formal marker or the next, phrase or whatever it is. And because there are a lot of accelerando and ritornando in this piece, there's a lot of this, expansive, this elasticity of tempo. If one part is, if two parts are accelerating, but one part is accelerating at a different rate, there's no convenient way to write that rhythmically, or no practical way to do it without just, having to do more math than interpreting. And that's where I probably would differ with, some of the new complexity school, like the Brian Fernihos that, write these incredibly, mathematically complex rhythms in order to, or what's Jason Eckert, he writes these, insanely impossible rhythms. And, it's funny, even with Jason, I remember reading something or hearing him talk about something once where he was, trying to approximate the rhythms of these jazz solos, and, as we all know, jazz never falls, a lot of jazz doesn't fall exactly on the beat, and there's, that's part of the style. You're either supposed to be a little ahead or a little behind, and, sometimes the irrational rhythms, are even more irrational when you transcribe them exactly. And I mean, that was, his effort to be very specific about that. Whereas I fall more into the realm of the practical, I find it fascinating that people do that. But, if somebody's improvising something, I don't think they meant necessarily for you to notate it to that extreme, and the feeling of it being improvised is certainly going to be tampered with to a certain extent. Somebody has to be subdividing and thinking on that level. Again, that could be justified as another aesthetic entirely. But I feel like if something is supposed to feel improvisatory, or it's supposed to feel like there's independence between the voices, well, why not simply just notate it so that there is that freedom, and make sure you organize it in such a way so that each party in this, interpretive improvisation knows where to land, Mm-hmm. So, and I mean, this is nothing new in the world of contemporary music. I mean, Lukaslavsky was, doing this in the 60s, and, maybe even, 60s for sure. So, but at the same time, like I said, it's new territory for me and for my language. So it will be new, because my language hasn't existed like this in quite some time. I had one experiment with it when I was still in school. One of my professors forced me to do it. You're always so, rhythmically driven. Can you have something where the rhythms are freer? And I remember my first attempts at that were, a little forced. And he let me know. He's like, well, you could have just written this metered, it didn't need to be written like this. I'm like, yeah, you're right. And so, I had a couple more stabs at it, and I did write something that was, but it never stuck around as something that felt organic to me. But in this piece, it just kind of happened
Hmm.
like that.
Well, that's kind of nice, right?
Yeah, it is. No,
So
that's
the section you referred to, is there any, improvising elements in it, or it's mostly written out?
it. Yeah, it's mostly written out. I don't, I don't say, well, here are 17 notes. You can play them in any order, kind of thing.
We've done that
I
too
yeah,
in different pieces.
yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Um, yeah, there, I have, I think, my limits of looseness.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
pretty,
no.
I'm pretty wound tight.
I
But
think it's better for me too. I don't like to make up stuff. So,
well,
especially in random order, and each time you're supposed to do it differently or different timing, right? I don't know if, yeah,
yeah, it's well, I mean, I think it's a good exercise, especially for those of us who were, classically trained. We, unfortunately, in the 20th century, improvisation in classical music was kind of lost.
hmm
Whereas it was just, I mean, the 17th and 18th century, it was, just what you did. I mean, they were playing chord charts in the Baroque, you know, uh, you know, and we lost that, in exchange for, technical acuity. I think, the standards of performance just kept going up. This relentless, focus on, perfecting and, polishing, took over, and that started to, take up most of our time. And there are a lot of good things about that, certainly. I mean, pretty much every time, you hear a sanctioned performance, by a reputable institution, it's going to be a great performance of some kind, or at least it's not going to be, cringy. but but yeah, I mean, I do feel like, I mean, I feel that loss sometimes in myself, being brought up as a classical musician. And I mean, I kind of, I took my couple of stabs at, being an improvisatory musician, early on in college. I played in a couple of jazz bands and took some jazz lessons with a jazz pianist there. And, later in life, I picked up the, jazz harmonization books, and, but it's just like, it feels too late. I can do a certain amount of it, but, it will never in public. And, I mean, I feel that loss, and, you know, I think it is, but I think it is good for us as classical musicians to be challenged in that way, even if the results aren't, spectacular. I think it does, and coming back to the idea of acceptance, what else is there in the realm of
yeah.
improvisation? You just have to accept what comes in the moment. And, we have not been trained in acceptance very well,
Yeah, I
it's like,
know. That's definitely a challenge, I think.
yeah.
I took two lessons with a friend of mine who's a jazz violinist. So,
Mm.
and I became such an interesting project for him that he couldn't understand why somebody who has such good technical capacity would not be able to hold a long note while thinking about what comes next. He just, he said, well, there's no right way, wrong way of doing it. If you don't know what to do, hold a note, and while you think about it and doodle something. And I couldn't, I freeze, and
Yeah, yeah.
he thinks, he's so funny, because I think last time he texted me was a few months ago, and he said, I have some new methods. I want you to try it on you. And I said, well, I'm actually not in Chicago. I was on tour That was like
Yeah.
back in January. I said, I'm in Europe, I won't be back until 2 weeks later. He said, escaping the jurisdiction of America wouldn't help you because you have to come back to. So he was just joking with me because I'm such a project for him. He just doesn't understand somebody who can play the violin. But, coming back to the point of what you made, I think my struggle, like I recorded this piece by Vivian Fung on
Oh, I love her music.
yeah, she's great. So it's this violin piano piece called Bird Song, and there is quite a lot of elements that in there that I have to make up stuff, But I feel like that I could somehow with that piece it wasn't as difficult because there's a basic harmonic progression that I knew I had to make up things that fit into the certain sound. So I could accept that, okay, it comes out different each time and comes at whatever moment, but I had a basic idea what to do with what sound I want to come out, what effect I want to come out. And I had more trouble, several of the Music Now concerts that I played.
Yeah.
It's so random. And to me, it's so ineffective, whatever I was doing. That became a problem because I can't really accept that this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
And everybody is doing random things. And the collective sound is more of a atmosphere rather than something concrete. So I had trouble with that.
Yeah.
And so, so I don't know if it's we can continue. You tell me what you think of what I just said.
Yeah, no. I think this is kind of an issue with a lot of new music, and I've heard it articulated by various critics too. And this may just be the old fogies, saying, well, music in my day, but there, what seems to be lost a lot of times these days because there's such a fascination with timbre now. It's the it's the least explored territory of the territories that we have to explore in music, and people are obsessed with it. And so sound sculpturing is really kind of the thing that people gravitate towards as composers a lot these days. And the ideas of narrative, of structure, are kind of, I think, sometimes seen as antiquated approaches to writing music. But quite frankly, I think regardless of what it is you want to focus on, you have to have structure. In a music that is expressed over longer periods of time, at least, anyway. Because without a structure, you lose people at a certain point. I mean, we as human beings have limits to our attention spans, and our attention spans need to be guided in order to stay engaged with things. So yeah, I mean, I think if it goes from one sonic idea to another without any kind of guiding light, for lack of a better term, then it often sounds very dissociated to those who have not been involved in the creation or the performance of that piece, or who don't share that aesthetic. Because sometimes folks share an aesthetic and they can kind of get themselves into anything that shares in that idea. But I mean, my personal feeling is that it has gone a little far in that direction, and the praise lapped on music that explores new sounds has been at the expense of the greater observation of what makes a piece of music really resonate and really great, what makes it lasting. Certainly we know that in hindsight, but it's oftentimes difficult to see in the present. certainly there were more composers than, Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn in the classical period, but those are the ones that, had this kind of lasting impact. And, of course, there were probably many others deserving that didn't, come to the fore because of, whatever reason. But certainly those did deserve, and there are reasons, and it does have to do with setup and timing and structure, and how do those those composers hold your attention. That the need for that's never going to go away, regardless of what we discover new in terms of creating music. Um, it still needs some kind of structure. And I know there's folks who would argue with me. Well, there is, certainly music that exists on a kind of a different level or serves a different function. I mean, gamelan music certainly doesn't, necessarily have, the same kinds of, structures. They have, these internal microstructures, but it doesn't have the same kind of, well, it's going to last this long. It's going to, there's more of an open-endedness to that, but it serves a different function, or it serves a different audience. But if you're talking about music for the concert stage, and that is meant to, tell a story, then you need that level of structure, I think. But at the same time, I'm grateful for even those experiments that don't work out, or at least don't work for me, because they open up possibilities. They enlighten, as to what other avenues could you go. Maybe I wouldn't, have the freedom to go where I'm going right now, even though it's, not nearly that free. But without those examples, without that influence, it does challenge you, to look at your preconceived ideas about what music is supposed to do or how it should be, and allows you to open it up to more so that it can be more. So, yeah.
I think of those kind of atmospheric pieces, and I always think about different kind of listeners and audience members and what they're going for. There are some people that want to listen and they want to be very intellectual and follow along and clear pattern, but then, and I guess that's kind of the camp I fall in because of my training, but then I hear other people talking about how they just really get lost. And how can you do that? You don't hear this and this and this, but some people really do just kind of lose themselves. I kind of wonder, like, those more, atmosphere kind of pieces, if it's just a shift in how you listen that would be helpful, or if it's really the music itself or the performance itself.
Yeah, no, you make a valid point. I mean, I think the setup is important, and to have context, and I think for an audience it is really important for them to be given that context so that they have the freedom to come to it how they are most naturally going to come to it. Yeah, I mean, and obviously, even as I'm talking about this, I realize my own biases, uh, you know, about what music is and what it should communicate. I guess there really are no shoulds. There are those things that we relate to more, and those things that we relate to less. But I think, again, it comes back to acceptance. You have to, accept that about yourself so that you can continue doing what you do and not be, hot and bothered that maybe somebody else doesn't think, what you're doing is valid, or maybe you don't think what somebody else is doing, in the moment is valid. It all is, take a step back. Let's just, recognize the value of all of this. And then as Phil Glass once said in a lecture that I happened to be at, and he's like, well, we're not dropping bombs, that's in the end, that's the great value. We're not destroying, we're creating. We're discovering our world and all of the mysteries of it in different ways, and musicians do that through, the exploration of sound and how that makes us feel and how that makes us perceive the world differently. Um, that's kind of always been my motivation behind, writing music. I mean, I think I could have probably been other things too. I feel like I could have been an architect. I love the way, space can make you, can transform your idea of the world and make you, you know, feel like you come out of the doldrums of your ordinary into something a little more extraordinary. But sound is another one of those things. It's a sense that just like our sense of smell can conjure, a memory or an idea of something. Our sense of hearing and our response to that is really immediate, and it can really transform the moment, um, and and help it to be, because I mean we all dream about something greater. That's another uh, I think truth of humanity. We're always thinking about the greater, whether it's in a religious way, a philosophical way, you know, but or even just a very everyday sort of way. Americans are especially addicted to thinking, well, how could my life be better? But I think substantially, spiritually, speaking, we look for things that take us out of this hazy reality into something that is a little bit more colorful, that is, a little bit more, that maybe hints at the mysteries of the things that we don't understand. When music does that, there's no better feeling. And so, yeah, I feel like it's all to the best possible cause when we put something out there, no matter what it is.
So very interesting, like, as you're talking, like I can't even keep up with my own thoughts. So I don't know if I can, it's like it triggers things in my mind that we think about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And, one thing definitely I was just thinking about comparing, again, talking about books and literature, in some ways it's so similar because you have to put your thoughts down, right? Whether it's in notes or in words. And reading a book, like what makes it a good book,
Mm-hmm.
usually goes along with, is there a message? Does it make
Mm-hmm.
you feel emotionally different, intellectually different before and after reading a book?
Mm-hmm.
So as you are talking about music, it's the same thing, right? If it's atmospheric, I think for me, it's not enough personally
Mm-hmm.
as a performer. And even playing something that I don't have initial um, visceral connection, I would have to study it enough so that I have some kind of
Yeah.
connection, whether on the intellectual level or
Yeah.
emotional level. So, but does that make it a piece of music naturally better, lends itself better because it already has that
Mm.
tangible part in the intangible? Because music is abstract. We all know that. We talk about this. You can't put
Mm-hmm.
words to it. You can't put your fingers on it,
Right.
but it still has to have something to hold you, right? Like you said,
Right.
what makes you listen to the piece from beginning to the end? Or
Right.
it's just, I get lost. Maybe some people coming to concerts, the point is to be lost so that you don't
Mm.
have to deal with
Yeah.
the reality or whatever. And so that's that whatever atmospheric piece serves the purpose they want. But for me, I always want something that I can go away with, right?
Let me make an analogy, because I mean when you say it that way, some people want to get lost. Sometimes, like for instance, the art that is hanging on someone's wall, it's just simply to create a mood in the room rather than the art itself. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I mean, artists will balk at that, because that's not what art is supposed to be. It's not, but sometimes it is for that. Sometimes it is just to lend a soothing calm to, or to give a certain energy to a room. Sometimes people need art for that reason. Who are we to say that that is wrong? It's not. If it serves a valuable function for them, a valuable spiritual function for them in that way, we just happen to be artists who are so deep into our own stuff that it's like we know, we know this trade in and out, and we've listened to and studied so much that we've kind of got through the stuff that is surface appeal, and to the stuff that has this kind of like you keep wanting to go back to that room. And like you say, it's in literature too. I mean, I used to like to read stories regardless of whether it was good literature or not. I used to like to, like I was especially into sci-fi or fantasy, and it was like even if it wasn't great writing, just the story itself or being transported to this other world was enough. Now I find it's, yeah, I find the same thing. Oftentimes it's not enough for me. I mean, if I start reading a sci-fi book and it's like there are no characters as such, I'll just put it down. I'll say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to waste my time on that. But, you know, I can be, I don't necessarily need to go to that genre to, any more of those genres that I used to gravitate toward to find that level of being transported. I find I'm most transported when the writing is just really, really good. So subtle that you don't notice what it's doing to you until after, you know. um, we just actually, my son listens to a lot of books on tape. We had a real thing about reading to him when he was young, and so he's a very good reader, and and when he's not reading, he's listening. And it's amazing to me the type of stuff he listens to as a 13-year-old. I mean, or what he chooses to, and we, he has some books that he was supposed to read for school, and he doesn't want to read any of those. And but when given a choice, he said, "I want to listen to Joy Luck Club," and I was like, "Wow, that's an interesting choice for a 13-year-old." But part of it I think is he's kind of connecting with the Asian part of himself, and really I self-identifying that way. And I think stories that include Asian culture, Asian heritage are appealing to him. But I also think it's because he's listened to a lot of good literature, and that book is just an absolute masterpiece of language and of communication of idea, and of portraying character you know, without being descriptive. It's so yeah, that's for me that's what's exciting when something gets to that level of being able to communicate without saying it out loud. you know,
Yeah.
you just feel its impact from the words, and you're not quite sure why. That's what we study. We study the why. Why did that work? How does and then as then it becomes your language once you understand why it works. And that to me is what's exciting in listening to music, is when a composer really understands why does this work.